Can I start on a note of amity, which will certainly not continue, but at least at the very beginning of the proceedings, and wish the First Minister, indeed all his ministers, a Happy New Year. And I do genuinely wish them success, although I think it's unlikely to be realised. Can I return to the point which was raised by Stefan Lewis earlier on, and I'm sure everybody would agree with this too, say that it's actually an inspiration to us all for him to be here today, and if it's not too frightening a prospect, I'm right behind him in his battle against his terrible disease. But I welcome the transition fund, which the First Minister has announced. But does he not agree with me that that would be far more effective if the Welsh Government weren't so relentlessly pessimistic about the opportunities presented by Brexit? And can I ask him in 2018 for a change of approach to this opportunity for the whole of Britain? And if he's more positive and uplifting about the future, then Welsh businesses themselves will have more confidence in the future, and investment will increase, and we will all be better off.
Well, first of all, could I wish him all the best as well, and say to him, I congratulate him on the temporary expansion of his group. We know it didn't last very long, but there we are, back to the famous five. In terms of the EU fund, businesses are saying to us that they're worried about Brexit. They're worried about the nature of the trading relationship with Europe. That's their major market, and why should it not be? More than 60% of our exports go there. More than 90% of our food and drink exports go there. It's fantasy to suggest that somehow a new market or markets would appear by next year in order to mop up all these exports. If we cannot get right our relationship with our nearest, biggest market, what hope have we got of conducting any kind of agreement with any other market or nation? So that has to be done first. Now, we don't know what Brexit will look like. Very good to see the UK government is moving towards our ground compared to where they were last year. Last year they weren't going to pay for any kind of financial deal. They weren't interested in EU citizens. They weren't talking about a transitional period. They've done all that. We welcome the fact that they've moved towards the light in that sense. But I have to say to the member, it's important to be realistic and not be a fantasist when it comes to Brexit. In the referendum, we were told time and time again by members of his own party, there will be a trade deal. We can be like Norway. Now we're hearing, well, don't worry about a trade deal. Well, businesses are worried about the lack of a trade deal.
Well, can I respond to the First Minister's sally about our temporary expansion of our group? That UKIP has done a great deal since the beginning of the year to entertain the country and cheer us all up. But we are here to fight for what we believe in, and we will continue the fight as we have done in the last year with a group of five. But one of the opportunities which the Brexit offers to us, if we are not part of the single market, is that we then secure control of regulation. And he'll have seen that last week the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive came into force throughout the whole of the EU. I mean, this is 7,000 pages long. It contains 1.4 million paragraphs. It's 6 times the size of the Bible, and it will require all financial firms that deal in shares, bonds, derivatives, and indeed all financial instruments to acquire a huge mass of documentation which they'll then have to publish and preserve for 5 years, imposing mammoth costs on financial services firms. If we're outside the single market, we can slim down that burden of regulation without any danger to the public at all. And Dublin has made a great success out of the expansion of its financial services businesses by having a tax advantage by reducing corporation tax. Does the First Minister agree with me that Cardiff, as a developing financial centre, could greatly benefit by a slimmed-down financial regulation system whilst properly preserving the public interest? That 10% of people who work in Cardiff are in financial and professional services. They contribute 1.2 billion a year in GVA, and indeed in Wales as a whole 3 billion. So will the First Minister agree with me that it would be a good thing if he were to look to having proportionate regulation in the financial services sector as a means of kick-starting the financial services industry here in Wales?
Well, of course, first of all, I don't begrudge his party's ability to provide us with entertainment, as he rightly pointed out. But in terms of the points that he makes, first of all, the issue is not devolved, as he knows, but in terms of the principle of it, I don't agree with him that the point of Brexit is wholesale deregulation. Our financial services sector will still have to operate in the European market. If it doesn't follow the rules of the European market, it will be able to operate there. And that will have enormous consequences for jobs, not just in Wales, but also in the rest of the UK, particularly the City, where the City has been a place where a great deal of European operations have taken place. If the regulations in the UK are substantially different, then people won't come to the UK because they want to operate in a bigger market. Secondly, we have to remember that the financial crash of 2007 was caused, at least in great part, by deregulation of financial services. And the fact that an opportunity was given to irresponsible financiers to play around with people's money, to lend to people who had no hope of paying them back, and the financial system collapsed as a result of it. So from my perspective, yes, regulations has to be proportionate, but it has to be there because, bluntly, given what we saw in 2007-2008, there are some who work in the large financial centres in this world who cannot be trusted with other people's money.
The First Minister knows that MiFID has nothing to do with the kind of conduct which caused the crash, or made it far worse in 2008, when I remind the First Minister, of course, we had a Labour government and a Labour Chancellor of Exchequer, a Labour Prime Minister, who himself wanted a light-touch regulatory system. Of course, we all learned great lessons from that. But regulations such as MiFID II, which require this vast amount of information storage and retrieval, is far too great for any regulatory body to be able to use effectively. So it's imposing a vast cost upon firms, and therefore the public at large ultimately bear the cost of all business taxes, for no practical benefit to anybody at all. And the result of that is to drive financial services business away from Europe altogether to places like New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, so on and so forth. So for Britain, there's a great opportunity post-Brexit. If we can't do a deal with the EU, and nobody ever guaranteed any kind of trade deal with the EU, nobody was able to do that. That's not in our gift to force the EU to enter into a deal with us. We just said it was in their own self-interest, as indeed ours, to come to an agreement. But nobody could force them to do that. But if no such deal is available, then the world out there is much bigger than Europe. 85% of the global economy is outside Europe. Should we not be positive about those opportunities rather than relentlessly negative and saying that the future lies in what is a contracting part of the world economy?
Well, the thing is, he contradicts himself now, because he complains about a directive. In the future, the UK will have no role at all in influencing those directives. The UK will have to accept them or not have access to the European market. So the UK's voice is much diminished now compared to where it was in the past. And secondly, he seems to think the world out there is a world that is open to trade with the UK. Other markets are equally as closed. If you look at the US, that is a market that does not trade freely with the rest of the world, nor does China, nor does India. There seems to be this thought in some in his party that somehow the world is just waiting to conduct free trade agreements with the UK. That's certainly not what other countries are saying, and certainly not what the experience has been in the past. 6 or 7 years is the average timescale for agreeing a free trade agreement. We have in the US a president who puts America first. Does he really think that we will have an equitable free trade agreement with the US with a president who is open about his views on protecting American industry? Will we have, for example, a backdoor TTIP as a result of the trade bill, which forces us to privatise large parts of the public sector, something which we would oppose tooth and nail? But ultimately, as I've said before, we are at present in the single market. I'd like us to stay in the single market or have full and unfettered access to the single market. We already have a great deal of convergence with it. If we cannot agree a deal with a market where we have so much in common to begin with, we have no chance of agreeing a deal with other markets that are much, much different, with different regulations that we would then have to try to harmonise. The European market is our biggest market. It's on our doorstep. We have a land border with it. We export 60% of our exports to it. We cannot allow our policy on the European single market to be blinded by ridiculous nationalist nonsense.